The Flintstones and the Jetsons, Issue 17. Jane apologizes to Judy when she is unhappy and says she needs her to babysit Elroy because she and George are going to the opera and Rosie's off at the robot oil spa. Judy's upset because all of her friends are going to dock in front of the future 7-Eleven because there's a new shipment of Neptunian water, since it's a magical other Neptune. George falls into a stereotype instead of being interesting, as he doesn't want to go to the opera, and would rather watch the Zero-G Orbit Ball finals tonight. So Jane's totally unsympathetic here. All of her relatability has evaporated in this one panel because she has no excuse for ruining George's night when she could go alone and save money. You'd think she would feel guilty. The writer should have come up with a better excuse for them to leave. Especially since, because it's the future, George should have been able to record the sports game on PVR. He tells her she has her cloning project due on Monday, and tells her to work on it tonight. Already there's been places in the real world where they've made cloning illegal without a second thought. So there's no way Judy would have this as a school project. We say that Judy won against Elroy a lot in a video game. She tells Elroy to go to bed and Sonic his teeth. He wishes he had a nicer sister so he could get more candy. Judy says that if she cloned herself, she could make a babysitter and finish her homework. Why didn't she think of this earlier when it'd be that useful? Why doesn't Elroy have this kind of mad scientist plot when that'd be in character for him? But it is captivating because it's Judy. And the story desperately needs positives right now. She decides to call her friend and tell her she can still go out. Why does she hope Rosie remembered to clean her skirt? Of course she'd remember. Elroy puts more sugar in the clone vat to make it a lot sweeter. Judy wonders why the clone is ready early. I assume it's because more mass was put into the potion. And eventually Elroy introduces her to her clone, who suggests being nice to each other and hugs her. Elroy explains what he did, which is surprising, and it's better than letting her think she did the project wrong. Judy too carries Elroy, calling him wonderful, and Judy gets reassured that she'll do a good job. At least Judy's hesitant. She gets sent away by the exit tube, and predictably, Judy too agrees to games and candy. I like that Elroy complains about the fact that Judy too hasn't even been trying to win. He's already getting realistic consequences from this. I also like that she's happy about losing, since she was made to be as nice as possible, so it could make sense. She gives him more candy, and he says he doesn't feel too good. It's nice of him to let her have the rest of it. She eats it, and she says she needs more sugar because it makes her nicer. So she ends up going to the old candy recycling plant and eating from it while using convenient super strength. And she's also a giant now. Somehow she doesn't understand that he's trying to tell her not to try to get a new hairdo. I guess it makes sense that she'd think she needs a new hairdo though, because it'd make her look more unique from Judy. But she wouldn't try to get the people at the beauty salon to do her hair, because she knows she'd scare them with how big she is. And that wouldn't be nice. If she's as nice as possible, she would regret scaring them. It's obvious that too much sugar made her lose her empathy. But since sugar made her have more of it than usual in the first place, that doesn't make sense. So it also doesn't make sense that she jumped on the roofs of apartment towers and hugged one. Judy throws a bottle of blue liquid at her to dissolve her with water. Part of the reason clones would be banned would be from a fear of overpopulation, not to mention making the unemployment rates even worse. But while them being ridiculously easy to kill would solve that, it doesn't change the fact that it's creating sentient life that people could sympathize with, so it'd still be illegal, especially out of pity for the clones. Of course, it feels like an asshole that water melts her like she's a wicked witch, especially since she looks just like Judy, so I would expect her to be made out of the same stuff. But since she was made out of a magic potion, it could make sense that it has that kind of chemical reaction. George tells Jane he didn't mean to fall asleep at the opera. Jane reminds him that his snoring got them ejected from the theater. I'm glad she got what she deserved. If only I saw it. He'd know why he got kicked out of the theater right away. So why is she reminding him of that? She compliments Judy on doing a good job looking after Elroy despite not knowing what went on there. It's unfair of her to forbid George from watching the end of his sports game, when somebody else could walk the dog. It's bad enough she forced him to go to the opera, so he deserves to get something he wants. Then George gets pounced by a ton of other Astros. Why not have Judy get all the slapstick? It makes absolutely no sense that she'd need to order decloning solvent and wait 10 days for it, when she just showed that they dissolve in water. Although the story did imply that Neptunian water was really rare. But if they call it water, doesn't that mean it's water? It should have been obvious to the writer that we'd want Jane to have to walk all those dogs. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, issue 18. I'm not interested in the first story because it doesn't make any sense that Fred Flintstone's boss would only become successful enough to buy the city if he didn't exist. So it's not going by logic and actually showing what it'd be like without him. The Jetsons story doesn't have any promise either because George gets upset with Elroy for saying Santa doesn't exist. George insists that he's wrong as an overprotective mother puts her hands over a kid's ears. It just looks ridiculous to me that someone would lie to their kid that Santa's real. I don't understand why any parents would do that when they have nothing to gain from it because kids will always be hitting up their parents for gifts and gift cards, regardless of whether they're lied to about this or not. I don't remember being raised like that. We see an obvious robot Santa, and Elroy says that's a robot. There's no way they would make the robot be obviously a robot if they haven't changed the lie to Santa's a robot to adjust. George calls him one of Santa's helpers. Elroy says he was told the truth by Spacely's son Arthur. I was impressed with Elroy for figuring out Santa wasn't real on his own because I thought it was the comic taking advantage of him being a genius for a change. But no, the writers don't even have that good sense here. So the writer that barely knows the show has it that somehow Elroy had to be told that it's scientifically impossible for Santa to make and hand out presents all over the world. But he lives in a world where the cars can go so fast that they can go to other planets within a day. So at that point I wouldn't doubt that there could be a way to make enough presents for every kid on Earth in time too, with automatic factories. Elroy should be saying that the reason he doubts his existence is that he was a myth long before the technology that could make a Santa possible was invented. I wonder if this will lead to George pretending to be Santa, and the story will be ruined by Elroy falling for his paper-thin disguise. George looks like a complete idiot by saying that there's some things you can't prove with technology. Writers, please don't remind me of the people like that in the real world. Jane admits to George that Santa isn't real, but then says Santa is real because he's in our hearts, which is stupid dialogue misusing the word real. Jane says that's so hard for a child to grasp, which is the writer thinking we're idiots for seeing how stupid her line was. That's like saying a character in a book is real because he's real in our hearts. George uses a clothing generator to make a Santa suit, and waits until night before telling his home security system to turn off the cameras. He disguises himself as Santa and tells the security cameras that never existed in his house before to turn back on. As I expected, the disguise is horrible because he doesn't wear a wig to hide his red hair. So the artist made a huge mistake there. He starts eating cookies, and speaking of huge mistake, instead of Astro being somewhere else, like in George's room, the writer completely ruins my immersion in the story by having Astro bite George, even though we'd smell him and instantly know it was him. And the only explanation is that he's just taking any excuse to bite him. And that's jarringly dark for the series. Then Rosie mistakes him for an intruder when I'd expect her to be asleep because it's midnight. But it could be excused because she's a robot. And while you shouldn't leave a computer on non-stop, it can handle not being put to sleep every single night. So it could make sense that Rosie works all night sometimes. But she could have easily not been in this room. Even though George talks, and obviously she would recognize his voice, not to mention his hair, Rosie hits him with a broom. Again, this would only be believable if she knew it was him and just wanted an excuse. But but I don't like that either. I feel like after her first episode, it's mostly just been the Child Teen comic where she and George hated each other, so it'd be out of place. The family would have heard all of this commotion and come out to look. After all, in the episode where Astro was introduced, George heard the commotion when a burglar went into his house and got chased by the robot dog, and he left his room to see him. The next morning, Elroy looks skeptical when in front of the presents. Jane asks George in a whisper how his leg is, as I really wish the story would give Astro karma, and Rosie too. Elroy uses a magnifying glass and can't find fingerprints. Judy reminds him that Santa wears gloves, and I wonder how Elroy the genius was so stupid that he didn't think of that first. Elroy asks the security machine to show him the next video, which doesn't have anything interesting except a pink blur, with presents in front of the tree after that panel. George thanks Judy for hacking into the security system, as it's revealed out of complete nowhere that she's good with technology. So good thing this is an alternate continuity. The show had better realize that Elroy would hear him, or it'll be absolutely infantile writing, since there was no effort to make it obvious that he and Judy were whispering, but instead I just have to assume that. Judy says they were grading her in a curve in her electronics class, and Elroy says there's a half-eaten cookie on the plate, and uses a convenient handheld device we never saw before to test the DNA of the cookie. You'd think there wouldn't be any cookies left. Jane whispers to George that he had better confess. This already gives away that Elroy somehow won't find out. He says this DNA dates from the 12th century, even though there's no reason that a DNA detector would ever know the difference between the DNA of 12th century humans and modern humans. And there's no way this evidence wouldn't have been faked. But it isn't revealed that Judy faked this too, as Elroy hugs him. What are the chances that by the time he would have gotten here, he would have only become full after taking one bite of that cookie? More likely that either he would have not eaten any cookies, or eaten all of them. And Jane shows George a note from Santa admitting that some things can't be proven with technology. That's a bad message in real life. The story should have shown Santa using magic to keep himself from being detected. Not to mention changing the DNA on the cookie. It would have to replace George's outright. If Elroy can find this out so easily, then it'd be far from the only family that would have discovered this. And it would have already been common knowledge among everyone that Santa's real, and therefore magic is real, which would lead to people being accused of being witches, if people didn't outright start worshipping Santa as a god. The final page is mostly wasted instead of showing us Santa using magic to conceal himself from the cameras. It is so lame that the story says Santa's real. All that does is reminds me that it's just a cartoon for kids, and that's the only reason it's being written like this. This series has been around since the 60s, so there's a very good chance that adults will be reading this comic, and that most of its fans will be adults. And I doubt any kids even knew about this comic, partly because it's based on such an old show. Not to mention I never thought of it as a kids show to begin with, because its protagonist is an adult. Elroy is much more of a minor character. We see a robot Santa turning off the light switch for Santa and his wife. And this is also the first time I ever saw Santa and his wife sharing a bed. This story by Matt Wayne is about Elroy making a nicer Judy clone to babysit him, after an enraging beginning where Jane looks like a horrible wife by forcing her husband to go with her to a place he doesn't care about instead of watching the game, and a bad mother too by forcing her daughter to babysit Elroy as a result when she could let George stay home. But because George didn't stand up to the bully, the plot happens. Good thing the pages after this make up for that first panel by being interesting, and showing how nice the clone is. Though it's laughably unrealistic that Judy has a cloning project for school. It's good that Elroy gets karma by suffering from realistic downsides of an overly nice sister, since he caused this whole thing too. Elroy gets Judy out of the house to be with her friends, but somehow it turns out that eating more sugar causes the clone to get giant and lose her empathy while confusingly still acting cheerful and affectionate. At least it was cool to see Judy bravely defeat her by throwing water to dissolve her. even if that comparatively tiny amount of water should have been enough to completely cover her and thus dissolve her. It only dissolved a tiny part of her. The fact that Chekhov's gun and it's already an unrealistic situation anyways is just enough for me to forgive it, but it's still an asshole that it worked. Even in the part of the story that made no sense, I still found it interesting, so I didn't really hate it. We didn't see somebody say that he can't really afford to fix the damages she did. Good thing Jane got kicked out of the opera as karma, but I wish I got to see it. And like the previous story, it's another story that feels like it never happened in the original show. This story by Matt Wayne was about George impersonating Santa in his house at night because he wants to make Elroy believe in him for absolutely no reason, after he finds out he doesn't from some kid, and conveniently, immediately takes his word for it. The writing falls apart by expecting me to believe a creature with an amazing sense of smell and Rosie won't instantly recognize George, and instead he gets hurt when he doesn't really deserve it, even if I did feel like he was doing something wrong by trying to mislead his kid for no reason. This would only happen if these two wanted to hurt George specifically. But I hate that too because the show as Astro acts like he loves him by being too affectionate. So this would be jarring character derailment, where he realistically got sick of him never appreciating him. Eventually, Elroy used the Deus Ex Machina machine to find out that there's 12th century human DNA on the half-eaten cookie, which obviously replaced George's DNA. Are 12th century humans really that different to DNA from us to the point of it being justified that this machine would even know that? We were still the same species when we were cavemen a very long time ago. And there's just no reason the machine would even point out how old the DNA is if it is noticed. Since Santa left a note, it's clear that the reason he left the cookie there was specifically so they would find out he exists. What are the chances he would have waited this long to reveal his existence if for some reason he wanted to keep his existence a secret before this? The story talks down to its audience by confirming out of nowhere that Santa's real in its universe, which tore me out of the immersion again when having an animated art style doesn't justify this. If it can be proven that Santa's real that easily, Elroy and Spacely's son would have always known he's real because this would have happened in other families, so none of this plot should have happened. Most of the story wasn't worthwhile at all. It just seems too fantasy for there to be Santa in a Jetsons story. And it's not like it's a genie where it could lead to something really interesting. This is just cliché.